Good morning. Welcome to the Colorado River Water Supply webinar. My name's Elizabeth Waite. I am a program coordinator with NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System. For today's webinar, I'm really pleased to introduce Paul Miller and Shauna Tiggy. Heather Patno with the Bureau of Reclamation had planned to join us today, but unfortunately she's out sick, so Shauna will be presenting on Heather's behalf. Paul Miller is the Service Coordination Hydrologist for NOAA's Colorado Basin River Forecast Center in Salt Lake City, Utah. Paul is also the climate focal point for the office. Prior to joining Colorado Basin River Forecast Center in November 2012, Paul worked for the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation Lower Colorado region for 7 years. His work focused on investigating the impacts of climate change to the Colorado River Basin. Shauna Tiggy is the hydrologist for the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation Lower Colorado region. Shauna has worked for the Bureau of Reclamation's Lower Colorado region for nearly 15 years. She is based at the Boulder Canyon Operations Office and is currently the team lead for daily and mid-term Lower Colorado River operations. After Paul and Shauna's presentations, we will open the webinar for your questions. Andrea Baer with NOAA's National Weather Service Western Region will facilitate the Q&A. Throughout the entire webinar, all participants are muted, so if you have questions, please type them into the question box that is in your GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded, and the webinar recording will be made available on drought.gov, and all listeners, all participants in the webinar will receive a notification from NIDIS that the webinar recording is available. Before we begin, I want to thank the many organizations and individuals who put together and support this webinar series, including Bureau of Reclamation, NOAA's Colorado Basin River Forecast Center, NOAA's National Weather Service and Climate Prediction Center, state climatologists, and many, many others. Their willingness to take their time to share their expertise and to guide the content of these webinars is invaluable to providing you with the most up-to-date and valid information on drought and forecasting. So thank you all. And now I'm going to turn over to Paul with our thanks. I am working on turning it over to Paul. Okay.
Yes, show my screen.
Thank you, Paul.
How does that look? Does that look okay? Oh, let me.
I can still see your screen.
Oops. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. And yeah, thanks so much, Elizabeth. Thanks for having us present on this. I'm going to present really just a quick overview of the type of work that we do at the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center and how that work goes to help inform some of our stakeholders, including the Bureau of Reclamation. So I'm really going to skim over and just kind of touch the surface on a lot of this stuff. So if you have any other questions after the call or during the question and answer section, please feel free to let me know. So click, there we go. So just to give you the brief points that we're going to take away here is we provide like a really broad range of products and services that water resource managers and stakeholders use to make informed decisions. We're all about decision support here at the River Forecast Center. So whatever our user needs are, that's really what we're striving to answer. Data and coordination is so extremely important. Without good data and coordination with all of our partners, we just wouldn't be able to make the type of skillful forecast that we're able to make. And one thing I'm really proud of at the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center is that we're really adept at seasonal water supply forecasting. That's the spring runoff that's snowmelt driven. I feel like we've taken the lead with that from an organizational standpoint, and that we've really set a really high bar that we really keep trying to exceed. So Yeah, we're also a really great resource for kind of synthesizing all the weather and climate information that's out there and just showing how that impacts water supply. Just kind of a quick overview of what we're going to talk about. Who are we at the CBRC? We work with area weather forecast offices, and I'll show you a little bit of a map there, but really we work with a lot of water resource managers and stakeholders. We try our best to disseminate that information in useful and important ways. Then I'll provide a summary of key operations and what we do here. And then I'll talk about drought, since this is a drought call, and how that impacts the work that we do and how we kind of interrelate with that. So we're one of 13 river forecast centers, and you can see we're right there around Utah and Colorado and Arizona. I don't know if you can see my mouse kind of squiggling over it, but just basically the southwest portion of the United States. And we help, I think we have about 12 or so weather forecast offices out of the 122 that are nationwide. So we just help support NOAA's hydrologic services and products. And like I said, we're really focused on decision support. If users have needs, we really strive on being open and transparent and accessible and just meeting those needs. The Western RFCs, like the California and Nevada River Forecast Center and the Northwest River Forecast Center, we all provide water supply forecasts. Also some of the ones in the middle here, like the Missouri Basin, Arkansas, and West Gulf, they also provide some limited water supply forecasts. Like I said, we work with a really broad and diverse set of stakeholders. Federal agencies are one of our key stakeholders, like the Bureau of Reclamation, the Army Corps of Engineers. We also work with a lot of municipal and agricultural water users, like the big water users like Southern Nevada Water Authority, Central Arizona Project, Denver Water, those folks. We also work with a lot of universities and helping them with research. One thing I wanted to stress is that we're really data consumers. We don't have our own network of gauges that are out there. We really rely on information provided by many of our stakeholders, the USGS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service and their Snowtail network. We get reservoir management plans from Reclamation and others. It's all really important to making an accurate water supply forecast. So here's just a screenshot of our homepage of our website down in the bottom right corner. And one of our most popular products is our water supply forecast. That's kind of on the top right. But really, we're here to help a highly regulated, variable, and overallocated system. We really just strive to provide actionable information for resource managers so that they can make the best decisions that they can. We're not trying to make any of those decisions or policies. So we're kind of seen as an independent, unbiased third party. We just try and make the best forecast that we can, regardless of policy implications, regardless of what the drought conditions are. We're always making these forecasts all the time, and we're doing it just to the best of our ability. So here's just a quick schematic on how we develop a forecast, and there's lots of details that I'm going to be leaving out here, but basically we take all the best gauge data and plans that are out there. So if it's reservoir releases, if it's stream flow at USGS locations or other partner locations, the NRCS Snowtail network is really key. We use weather forecast information from the Weather Prediction Center and our partner weather forecast offices, and lots of additional sources. We've been starting to take in more remotely sensed data from NASA, and trying to use that to help inform our forecast. We feed all of that into a hydrologic model, which we interact with. This isn't just like a black box that we just throw everything into and just take what comes out. We spend a lot of time really looking at the forecast. We spend a lot of time doing quality assurance and quality control, making sure that the best data is going in and that the best data is coming out of our model. So what you get at the end of the day is a hydrograph on our website, one of many. I think we make over just about 500 forecasts a day throughout our area of responsibility, just kind of showing where we think stream flow is going, and how that might impact folks in the area. Our most popular product is our water supply forecast, and we utilize something called ensemble stream flow prediction, or ESP, which is really just a fancy way of saying we take a lot of historical traces and we look at this broad range of possibilities to make forecasts. And we'll talk a little bit about that more coming up here. We make seasonal forecasts. They're typically April through July, and they're probabilistic, they're volumetric, so that we're giving a wide range of possibilities for our stakeholders to use and make informed decisions on. We typically begin issuing these forecasts in January, and it's important to note that these forecasts are unregulated inflow forecasts. And what we mean by that is that these aren't forecasts of the physical water that you're going to see at a stream gauge location or going by a canal in your house. These are forecasts that we try and account for all the regulation, all the diversions, all the reservoir operations. We try and account for all of that so that we just provide a forecast of what we think would be going down the river without any of this human interaction there. And that allows our stakeholders to put these flows into their reservoir operations models or other models, and use that to figure out how to best operate their system. So here's just a snapshot of how we come up with this ESP. We do our very, very best to come up with a best representation of what's going on today. So we look at river and reservoir levels, we look at the current soil moisture, we look at the current snowpack, and we say, okay, this is the best representation of today's hydrology as we can get it. And then what we do from there is we run through all of basically our past history of weather since 1981 through 2015. And so we'll take all of 1981's temperature and precipitation, and we'll run that through till the end of the year. And we'll do that for all of these years, so 81 through 82, 83, all the way down to 2015. So we come up with a range of possibilities, 35 individual traces that kind of indicate where we might be headed from a seasonal runoff point of view. So once we take that range of possibilities, what you can see here kind of in the blue shading on the right-hand side of your screen, that's that range of those 35 traces. And every month, kind of indicated by the pink line, we make an official forecast, the first week about of each month. We make an official forecast that where we really look at the data, we look at the upcoming weather, we do our best to just make it the best forecast we possibly can. And then in between those pink lines is what we call our raw guidance. So this is just us running our model, not doing that deep dive into the data that we do around the first week of each month. So this is our most popular product, and you can see we kind of make this forecast. I think it's about 250 locations or so over our area of responsibility, and we're happy to give any particular forecast information if you're interested in any of these sites in particular. Just kind of how this all plays into the role of decision support for reservoir operators. You can think of us as the green boxes. We're part of the National Weather Service, and we're trying to produce information that folks can feed into their decision support model, whether that's a spreadsheet model, whether it's a more robust reservoir operations model like the one Reclamation uses. Whatever they're using to make their information, we want to provide that data in a way that they can ingest that into their operations model, so they can make decisions, and hopefully, and Reclamation does an awesome job of this. They communicate those decisions back to us, so we'll know, oh, hey, Reclamation's going to operate a dam a certain way. We can put that back into our forecast model, and we can provide even more accurate downstream reservoir forecasts. So this is just a schematic showing how we kind of interact with that process. So what about drought? So I put this slide together not just to show my awesome clip art skills, but also to show that drought's a really complicated question. And there's this whole spatial aspect and this temporal aspect to it. And it really depends on who you ask and when you ask them. I think if you talk with a lot of our agricultural partners, farmers in the area, we've had just a really wet winter. So far, we've had a wet spring. Just a nice, consistent weather pattern that's brought a lot of rainstorms. It hasn't been too terribly hot, so things aren't melting off too quick. I think they're pretty happy. You might find a farmer or folks in the agricultural world saying, "Hey, the drought's over. This is a great year." But then as you go downstream and you start talking to folks that operate the reservoirs, maybe for the larger reservoirs especially, we're still not, we're not even approaching something that I would characterize as full or comfortable for a lot of our larger municipal water users. So when you talk with some of our reservoir operators and some of our partners that run municipal water supply agencies, they're probably saying that the drought isn't over. So for us, it's not so much about determining whether the drought is over or not. We're just providing the best information that we can so that we can make the best decisions that we can, whether it's dry or whether it's really wet. So here's something really interesting that I kind of dug out. So this is kind of in the headwaters of the upper Colorado River Basin. So this is above Cameo in Colorado. And what you see here is this is the snowpack in the Colorado River Basin just above Cameo, just kind of looking at a bunch of snow-tell stations. And what you see in the blue line is this year's current snowpack. And back in 2014, we had a pretty similar snowpack, kind of accumulated about the same rate, kind of peaked about the same rate. And one thing I wanted to bring attention to is average Colorado temperatures in water year 2014 were a bit warmer than this year. And the precip in water year 2014 was also a bit drier than this year. So let's just kind of keep that all in mind. So 2014, a little bit warmer, a little bit drier, relatively same snowpack. And then this year, same snowpack, but we've definitely been wetter and we've definitely been cooler. But what about drought? So when you have these long, persistent dry periods, it definitely has an impact on runoff. So what you see on the right is the soil moisture conditions after this prolonged dry period that we've had over the Colorado River Basin. Well, leading up to 2014, it had been pretty wet. So soil moisture conditions on the left heading into 2014 were pretty good. So back in November 2013, we're looking at really good soil moisture conditions. Back this past November, things were very, very dry. So here's where our runoff for the April through July period at Cameo finished after that wet period. So we had a pretty good antecedent wet period heading into water year 2014. And you can see we ended at about 127% of average, just under 3 million acre feet worth of water. Okay, this year, so we've had similar snowpack, wetter conditions, and cooler temperatures. But this year, we're only forecasting about 118% of average at Cameo, just under 2.8 million acre feet of water. So you can see the impact that those dry conditions have really had on our forecast, because we're forecasting that we need more of that water to replenish these dry soil moisture conditions, and it's just a less efficient runoff. So soil moisture definitely has an impact on snowmelt-driven runoff, and just kind of putting what I showed into text here. So despite warmer temperatures and less precip in 2014, there was a higher April through July runoff volume than what's projected this year, just because the soil moisture conditions we're much better heading into that water year. So I just did a little bit of math there. It turns out it was about 7% less, or about 210,000 acre feet. So that's a significant amount of water, just due to dry conditions. So yeah, we provide this information regardless of whether we're in drought or not. The forecasts tend to be more depressing when it's not such a wet year like this year. But yeah, we try and provide this information all year round to all of our stakeholders. But yeah, persistent dry periods do impact runoff, and we do account for that in our forecast. And we just try and make this information so that everybody can efficiently manage water resources, regardless of whether or not we're in a drought. So with that, if there's any questions, I guess we'll wait till the end here, but I'll hand it off to Shauna. Feel free to contact us. There's my email and phone number information, and hope that was somewhat informative. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Paul. And I will turn it over to Shauna now. Thanks, Shauna.
All right, can you see my screen now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. All right, hi everyone. Oh, thanks Elizabeth, and thanks Paul for explaining the forecasts. We're going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk to you about the impact of drought on the Colorado River Basin reservoirs and what this wet year in 2019 means for reservoir operations. First off, just to kind of set the stage, explain the operational setting for anyone on the webinar who's not familiar with the Colorado River Basin. You can see the map on the right-hand side. The Colorado River Basin is divided into two subbasins, the upper Colorado River Basin, which ends just a little bit south of Glen Canyon Dam at the Leaf Ferry point, and then the lower basin down here, which has three major reservoirs on it, Lake Mead, Mojave, and Havasu. There are about 16.5 million acre feet allocated every year. 5.5 million acre feet are each allocated to the upper basin and the lower basin. Also, the treaty with Mexico allocates 1.5 million acre feet to Mexico. In terms of average annual natural flow, on average, we're looking at about 16 million acre feet long term. That is about 14.8 million acre feet in the upper basin. So clearly most of the inflow originates in the upper basin, and 1.3 million acre feet in the lower basin. With that, inflows are highly variable from year to year. In terms of reservoir storage, there are 60 million acre feet of storage, which is about 4 times the average annual inflow. So relatively, we have a very high amount of storage in the Colorado River Basin. And last thing I want to mention is the law of the river is really the foundation of the way we operate the reservoirs in the basin. All reservoirs and all operations, all water deliveries are governed by this foundation, the law of the river. Okay, moving on to the impact of the drought. This graphic here is system storage, end of water year total volumes, and it starts in 1960, goes through, oops, oh dear, there we go, sorry about that. Goes through 2018 and includes a projection of 2019 end of water year system storage. You can see back in 1999, we were near 94% of capacity. We were almost full in the system. And you can see a huge dip, a very steep decline very rapidly with the start of this long-term drought that we've been in. So with that, we declined very quickly to until about 2002, 2003, we've managed to kind of stabilize. We've gotten lucky with a few years of above average inflow, as well as new operations, which I'll discuss in a few minutes. And we've managed to stay around 50% of system capacity. Currently, as of today, we're at 45% of water capacity, and we expect to go up just a bit above 50%. I'm going to zoom in on a couple of our biggest major reservoirs. Lake Powell, again, you can see in 1999, pretty much full at 95% of capacity. By April of 2005, it had declined all the way down to 33% of capacity. But again, a couple of fortunate wet years during this period, and the interim guidelines had a bit of recovery here and there. At the end of March this year, we were at 37% of capacity. Here you can see a similar graphic for Lake Mead. Again, 95% of capacity in 1999 at the beginning of this drought period, and then a pretty consistent decline in reservoir elevations. You can see we had a bump in 2011 due to that very wet year. We ended March at 42% of capacity, and in July of 2016, Lake Mead had declined to its lowest elevation since it was first filled in the 1930s. It was down at 1071.6 feet in elevation. So what has been done up until now to address these dry conditions? First, you can see in 2007, we adopted the interim guidelines for coordinated operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. This created the capability for what's called intentionally created surplus. It gives the lower basin water users a little more flexibility to conserve water, a little more incentive to conserve water. In 2010, there was IBWC minute 318 with Mexico, which allowed Mexico to store some water in Mead, followed by another minute with Mexico, minute 319. We've also had a pilot system conservation program and the Lower Basin Drought MOU, which has been in place since 2014. And recently, IBWC minute 323 was implemented in 2017. With all of those programs, you can see the contribution of U.S. ICS, other voluntary contributions, Mexico's water reserve, which was created under those IBWC minutes, and other system conservation water. We've managed to conserve about 2 million acre-feet of water, which is equivalent to more than 25 feet in Lake Mead elevation. So this additional water in Lake Mead, in combination with balancing releases from Lake Powell, has effectively kept the lower basin out of a shortage condition for the past 5 years. So where are we now? This graphic shows the current status of the major upper basin reservoirs. So you can see up in the Green River, Fontenelle is down at 35% of capacity, which is normal. We're going into the runoff season, so we need to create space for that water to run into. Same with Blue Mesa. In the Aspinall unit in Colorado is at 34% of capacity. Navajo Reservoir in the San Juan Basin is at 62% of capacity, and Lake Powell is currently at 37% of its capacity. On the right-hand side, you can see our most recent inflow forecast issued by the CBRFC. And since April 1st, there have been a couple of changes, not very much. The Green River reservoirs, Fontenelle and Flaming Gorge, actually saw some increases this month. We're currently seeing a forecast of 102% for the April to July period at both Fontenelle and Flaming Gorge. Blue Mesa saw a small decrease since the beginning of April. It's currently at 127%. Navajo also a slight decrease at 119% of average, and then Powell has been consistent at 128% of average. So what does this mean? What do these current levels mean for operations? I mentioned the 2007 interim guidelines. You can see here, these are the different operating tiers under the interim guidelines. So on Powell's side, when the reservoir is full, it is in what's called the equalization tier with a minimum release of 8.23 million acre feet or higher, typically. Below that, there's the upper elevation balancing tier, and that is where you start to really see the coordination. You release 8.23 million acre feet unless Lake Mead is below 1075, in which case you would balance the contents with a minimum and maximum release between 7 million acre feet and 9 million acre feet. Below elevation 3575, you go into the mid-elevation release tier where the release is 7.48 million acre feet unless Mead is below 1025, in which case you would release 8.23 million acre feet. And then where we hope not to go, elevation 3525 is the lower elevation balancing tier where you're trying to balance contents with a min-max release between 7 million acre feet and 9.5 million acre feet. On the Mead side, when you go above 1145 feet in elevation, you're in a surplus condition. A little bit higher than 1145, it's called a domestic surplus. But once you get really, really high, then we're looking at a flood control surplus, or just shy of that would be a quantified surplus condition. Between elevation 1145 and 1075, you're in a normal or ICS surplus condition. That is the condition that we are in currently. And in this case, we deliver the full 7.5 million acre feet to the lower basin water users, plus or minus any ICS creation or delivery. Below elevation 1075 is when you're looking at shortage conditions. There are 3 levels of shortage. Below 1075 is shortage condition tier 1, below 1050 is tier 2, and below 1025 is tier 3. And then at that point, the states would consult on additional measures to prevent Mead from falling even lower. All right, so before I talk about projected elevations this year, I want to bring us back to the plot that Paul showed us a little earlier. It's important to look at the inflow forecast and how it has evolved this year in particular. So back in January, you can see pretty low forecast. It was just 64% of average. And you can see with each final forecast, the inflow forecast has steadily increased to where it is now at that 128% of average for April through July inflow. So let's look at how those inflow forecasts have impacted Lake Powell end of month elevations first. This red line here is from the most probable January 24-month study. This is our monthly operations planning model. And you can see it's a pretty dismal looking plot here. Lots of low elevations. The end of calendar year elevation was at 3566.75. Powell was expected to release 8.63 million acre feet in 2019 and 7.48 million acre feet in 2020, so falling into that mid-elevation release tier in 2020. February, a slight increase. There was, again, that inflow forecast was at 84% of average, so a little bit better, but still not great. We were looking at an end of calendar year elevation of 3572.2, and again, a release of 8.91 8.91 million acre feet in 19, and still in that mid-elevation release tier, releasing 7.48 in 2020. March, we saw a huge increase in the forecast. The March forecast was 102% of average. And with that, we saw a large increase in the projected elevations. We're looking at an end of calendar year projected elevation of 3586.5. So with that, Powell release was 9 million acre feet in 2019 and 2020. And most recently, the April 24-month study had that inflow forecast of 128% of average. And with that, we were looking at an end of year elevation of 3607.5 feet, with Powell releasing 9 million acre feet in 2019 and 2020. So a huge, huge change in conditions from a very, very dry 2018 to a very, very wet winter in 2019. Now, going down into the lower basin, it's been wet in the lower basin too. The heavy precip was not limited just to snowpack in the upper basin. Consequently, we've seen inflows much higher than projected almost every month during this water year above Lake Mead. With these observed Lake Mead side inflows, these are the intervening flows between Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam. We're looking at 130% of average for the water year and 126% of average for the calendar year. So at our current elevations between 1085 and 1090 range, that corresponds to about 85,000 acre feet of water per foot in elevation. So this means the side inflows alone have added about 2.5 feet in elevation to Lake Mead since the beginning of water year 2019. Looking on the downstream of Hoover Dam, on the water demand side, what this box plot shows is the distribution of monthly releases from Hoover Dam since the interim guidelines have been implemented, so 2008 through 2018. You can see that April is our peak water demand month, followed pretty closely those shoulder months of March and May. But this year, it has been so wet in the lower basin that demands have been very low. You can see in January, the water demand was down in the lower below. This box is the interquartile range. So 75th percentile to 25th percentile, well below the 25th percentile for January. February water demands, again, at the 25th percentile. March demands off the charts, so low. And then in April, this is a projection of end of April water demand below Hoover, and you can see it's also right at that tip in the lowest 5th percentile. Some of that water will remain in Lake Mead as conservation. Some of that water could be moved into later calendar months. The lower basin does operate on a calendar year basis, so the water users do have the opportunity to take water, their full allocations by the end of the calendar year. So we'll see how it evolves, but this really indicates just what a wet year it has been and the impacts on Lake Mead. So for my last slide, I want to do that similar plot, go over the evolution of those 24-month study models on projected elevations at Lake Mead. And first of all, I just want to point out where we are now at the end, basically the end of March elevations, where we thought we would be at the beginning of the year versus where we actually are now. Back in January, we expected to be down at 1083.5 at the end of March. In February, we expected to be down at 1085.3. In March, we were projecting 1088.2. And where we actually ended up was a full 2 feet higher at 1090.2. So it's, again, this year's really been extraordinary both on the supply side, on the inflow side, and on the demand side. And you can really see our projected elevations at the end of the calendar year as well. So back in January, we were projecting an end of calendar year elevation of 1067.7, which would have put the lower basin into a first level shortage in 2020. In February, a little bit better, 1071.5, but still lower basin shortage, tier 1. And then really it was that March inflow forecast with those Powell releases of 9 million acre feet in both water years, 19 and 20, along with those wet conditions and lower demands that really started to make an impact on Mead elevation. Back in March, we were projecting an end of calendar year elevation of 1080.85, which is in the normal or ICS surplus condition. And this last month in April, even higher at 1084.3 feet in elevation. So again, a normal condition. And that is my last slide, and I will turn it over for questions now.
Okay, thank you very much, Shauna. This is Andrea Baer with National Weather Service, and I'll be facilitating the questions portion of the call. And so if you would start typing in any questions in the chat box, that would be great. I will read them out and we will get them answered. If there are any questions we can't answer, Elizabeth's very good at finding people out there who can answer your questions. So any questions for Paul or Shauna on the operations of their groups or the current conditions in the Colorado Basin or the forecast coming up? I'll go ahead and give folks a minute or two to type in any questions. And Elizabeth just put on the screen a bunch of drought resources for everybody to use. And so at the very top in the brown, you'll see where the webinar recording will be once it has been put online. And if you have additional questions, Elizabeth would be the one to contact, and her contact information is also in that brown box. So I'll give it a minute for questions here.
Andrea, this is Elizabeth. Do you see the questions that are typed in there? I'm not sure if they're coming up on your screen or not.
I don't.
Okay, I'll read out some.
Oh, gosh, I'm sorry, I don't.
That's okay. Maybe they're just showing up on my GoToWebinar screen. There's a question from Tony Willardson to Paul. And Tony asks, what, if any, use does the RFC make of NOAA CPC 90-day forecasts? It appears that you only use statistical models.
Well, I wouldn't say we only use statistical models, but right now we currently don't use the CPC's 90-day forecast, but right now we are actively working with CPC to improve longer-term forecasts. Right now, I think we're focusing on that 2-week time period, yeah, right now we don't use the CPC's 90-day forecast, and we've done some looking at it, like as far as like skill-wise goes, and we just found it doesn't add skill to our current forecast, but we're definitely working with them to use their products and improve the forecast lead time.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And Felicia Fonseca has 2 questions. One is, what is Cameo? And her second question is, what, if anything, could change the predictions for Lake Powell and Mead, for instance, a terrible monsoon season?
Those are 2 really good questions. So Cameo is a little city in Colorado, and that's just the location of the gauge site where we're making the forecast for. So I think if you go on the USGS website and look for the Colorado River at Cameo streamflow gauge, that's where we're forecasting that flow to be. So that's just a point location. So Cameo is just I think it's just a little city in Colorado. For what can influence the inflow forecast into Powell at this point, lots of things. So basically, when we look at the historical weather going forward, we're looking at all those 35 years. And as you go through the months, the variability tends to get lower and lower because we have less and less snowpack. Right now it's nice because we know that we have a lot of snowpack and we know that that water is there. But there's certain things that could reduce the forecast. We could have a really intense warm up maybe that causes a lot of evaporation of that snowpack, or we could have just some really, really, really dry events that so we don't get the added precipitation that we expect in April and May. That could drive down the forecast a little bit. On the flip side, though, we could, we've had these really wet Mays lately that have brought a lot of rain to our area. So the forecast could still go up. We could have cooler temperatures like we've been having that could kind of reduce evaporation and kind of the transitive losses that go on as the snow melts occurring. So that might bump the forecast up a little bit too. So could go both ways. As we get through the season, though, that variability will get less and less.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Another question for you. How is the forecast and the service provided by CBRFC compared to the forecast from the National Water Center? Are there overlaps or competition between the two institutes?
Oh, that's a really good question. So we're actively working with the National Water Center. I would say that the biggest differences between the CBRFC forecast and the Water Center forecast is one the scale. We take into account a lot more variables regionally because we're so regionally focused. So we're accounting for all the operations that reclamation and others do in our area. We bring in the SNOTEL network into our forecast. So we're just bringing in a lot more information, which results in a higher level of accuracy for our forecast. And the relationships that we've built up with our partners goes a long way too. The Water Center is still relatively new, and they're still bringing people, into the fold, I guess, as far as just seeking their input, seeking their guidance. So they don't have the kind of relationships that we've developed over the years yet. But I don't mean to have any of that come off negatively. The Water Center is doing some really impressive things. It's this huge computational resource for NOAA and the Weather Service. I think in the future it can be really great for locations that don't have gauge information or locations where we don't have as much skill in our forecast, like where there's really flashy flooding events during the monsoon season or these really localized convective storms, particularly in the south. I think there's lots of opportunity for the Water Center to help there. So we're actively working with those folks. We talk to them quite a bit. We provide input. We compare all our forecasts to their forecast points where we overlap. And we provide feedback that way so that they can always look at how they're doing compared to us. So yeah, I think there's lots of good things coming from the Water Center in the future. But right now there's just a different level of service. They're trying to do it at a national scale and meet all these needs at a national scale where we're really focused on the regional and local needs.
Okay, thanks, Paul. And here's a question for both Shauna and Paul. What do you think is the big news this month that the average person in the Colorado Basin should know?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think from our perspective, I One thing I think that has been really interesting is that March was among the wettest on record if you look at the SNOTEL sites, especially the first 2 weeks of March. If you look at the SNOTEL sites and how much precipitation they were measuring for the first 2 weeks of March, especially in western Colorado, it was like either the record or within the top 3 of record. So just this very wet run into spring and these cooler temperatures, it's just been a very beneficial season from a hydrology point of view in the Colorado River Basin.
And Shauna?
And sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
And I would say on our side, on the operations side, we, going back to that question that Paul brought up on his slides, we do not consider this drought to be over. While we're pleased to see above average snowpack conditions this year, and we're really, we consider ourselves lucky to have seen this kind of improvement in the inflow forecast. So, but one near or above average one above average year is not going to end an extended ongoing drought, and it's not likely to substantially reduce the risk facing the basin in the future. We got lucky this year, and one good data point is not a trend, and so we're still very concerned about the ongoing drought in the basin. That's my one big takeaway that I would say.
Okay, thanks, Shauna. Another question for you, Shauna, while you're there. Please explain in greater detail the demand side of the equation with regards to Lake Mead.
Okay, so in the lower basin, the water demands are all of the water users, so the water contractors in the lower basin, as well as water deliveries to Mexico under the treaty with Mexico. As well, there's also, because we are in the Southwest where it is so hot and dry, there's a lot of system losses. So making up for those losses in terms of reservoir regulation kind of constitutes another demand on the system. So even though the legal, water demands might be, 7.5 plus, 1.5, we actually release quite a bit more than that on a typical year. We might release, 9.6 million acre feet on a typical year. Whereas on the inflow side, a typical average release from Powell would be 8.23 million acre feet. Then there are some side inflows below the basin or below Glen Canyon Dam, and we might see, maybe 9 million acre feet of inflow. Then there's also evaporation at Lake Mead, which, depending on the elevation and, the weather, we could be looking at anywhere from 80,000 acre feet to about 800,000 acre feet to 600,000 acre feet per year of lost in evaporation. So with this, you've got, it's just, a water balance. You've got more water coming out of Lake Mead than coming in, which is why we've been seeing those declines in elevation. And even with Powell releasing 9 million acre feet over these past few years under the interim guidelines, Powell has been operating in the upper elevation balancing tier, and we've been seeing an adjustment to balancing releases at Lake Powell. So we've been getting 9 million acre feet release from Lake Powell plus some side inflows, but still between evaporation and downstream water demands, it just hasn't been enough to really overcome all of the water demands. In terms of how those water demands are allocated, that 7.5 million acre feet, 4.4 million acre feet is allocated to California, 300,000 acre feet is allocated to Nevada, and 2.8 million acre feet are allocated to Arizona.
Okay, thank you, Shauna.
Sure.
A question for either you or Paul. How does detention of water locally affect the inflows to the river? Recently, I've seen lots of localities detaining or retaining 100-year flows.
I'm not 100% sure. So like detention of water, like in local little reservoirs and that sort of thing is what I'm guessing. The
That's what it
question
sounds
is?
like, yeah, from the question.
Okay. Well, with our forecasting, we do we account explicitly for flows that have some kind of gauge associated with them. So, you know, if somebody's got a small impoundment or even if they're flood irrigating and it's causing, and they're kind of holding the water that way, if there's a gauge somewhere along the line that captures that flow as it gets into the river, or if we can see that between two gauges that there's some kind of gain in the river, either through return flows or something like that, we account for that if we've got the gauge information. Where we don't have the gauge information, we actually use a separate model to estimate those flows that are coming into the river. So if it's a large amount of water that's being held back or somehow making its way into the Colorado River system, we're probably accounting for it in one way or another.
Okay, thank you, Paul. We have a question here from Joanna. It looks like Lake Mead will avoid a shortage in 2020. What about beyond 2020? Are there any additional long-term predictions?
That's a good question. So, yeah, it does indeed look like we're going to be able to avoid a shortage in 2020, but there's so much uncertainty going past that we very well could be in a shortage in 2021. What Reclamation does is we do a probabilistic outlook. We have probabilistic basin-wide models that we run 2 to 3 times a year. The last time we ran that outlook was in January, when our outlook was fairly bleak. We will be updating those projections probably within the next month. So we will have 5-year probabilistic projections for Lake Mead shortage, and we publish those results on our website. So you can go to our Lower Colorado Regional website and look at the 5-year operations outlook. And as soon as those are available, we post them to the website. So you'll be able to see the updates there.
Okay, thank you. Shauna, you partially addressed this question, but I'm going to read it again and see if you wanted to address this a little bit more in depth. Please address how one good year fits into the longer term picture, which includes aridification from climate change.
Okay, so how does one good year fit into the picture? Well, it buys us some time, is honestly the answer. That's all I can really say with any kind of certainty. You know, back in 2011, we had a really great wet year, and people were wondering if the drought was over. It was then followed by 2 years that were 2 of the driest years on record. So to say that one good year is going to have a long-term impact, you know, it just, we can't say that. Again, we consider ourselves lucky that we got this 1 year reprieve. and but luck and hope is not a way to, you know, manage and plan for the future, which is why we've got things like the interim guidelines and why they are passing things like the drought contingency plan in DC to make long-term plans on how to deal with threats to the water supply.
Right. So I'm cognizant of your time, and we have 3 questions remaining. Do you, Shauna and Paul, feel like you could stay a couple more minutes to answer these questions?
Sure, I can.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. So a question here, Shauna, I saw that the projection goes out about 18 months into the future, so I'm wondering how useful is the forecast beyond 6 months, and how those projections beyond 6 months are used in decision making?
Oh, okay. Really good questions. So beyond the calendar year, those projections are not used by reclamation for setting operational tiers. Those projections are used, however, by a lot of reclamation stakeholders for their planning. For example, National Park Service, Lake Mead National Recreation Area. There are a lot of businesses and concessioners, when they see a projection that goes below a certain level at any month of the year, they need to move their docks. They need to extend their boat ramps. They need to invest money. They need to have the capital to make those investments and changes so that they continue to run their business. Same with our water users. You know, if there's looking like a possibility of a shortage 2 years from now, that water agency that could be impacted needs to start planning now for that potential. How are they going to meet their customers' water supply needs if we do go into a shortage? In terms of what is used for those projections, in terms of the inflow forecast, the CBRFC provides an inflow forecast only for the current season, the current year. So we go in our 24-month study model, we use the 30-year average inflow. And it is an average. We know that there's a lot of uncertainty in that. So we, 4 times a year, we run 3 different 24-month study scenarios in addition to the most probable. We also run a probable minimum scenario, which is a 90% probability of exceedance inflow trace, and a probable maximum, which is a 10% probability of exceedance trace. So we have 3 that range 4 times a year. Also, we have another operational model that is called our midterm operations probabilistic model, or our MTOM model. That takes the full ensemble that the CBRFC develops. It's 35 different inflow scenarios, all of those traces that you saw on the plot that Paul provided. All of those traces are run through the model, and we get a range of projected elevations in the out year, and those that we kind of create some frequency tables and some, you know, plots that kind of like those cloud plots that kind of say, okay, we are looking at elevations between, you know, X and Y range, and that is a really useful risk-based decision-making tool for our stakeholders as well as for our own management.
Okay, thanks, Shauna. Tony Willardson asks the question, how do you account for changes in base flows from groundwater given USGS studies?
That's a really good question. So I think the best way that we do it, we don't explicitly have like a base flow. Well, there's no like base flow component, I guess, of our model. But what we do is we have our model is really reliant on soil moisture conditions. and I should stress that they're modeled soil moisture conditions. So we spend a lot of time in the fall before gauges start to freeze, really calibrating our model, and particularly that soil moisture component of our model, to make sure that we're modeling base flow as accurately as we possibly can. And so when the gauges freeze and we're kind of making forecasts without that observed data for a little while there in the winter, we hope that the model is still accurately reflecting flow conditions in the basin. So I guess the way we kind of account for base flow is we do it through our accounting for soil moisture and doing our best to accurately model soil moisture conditions in the basin.
Thank you, Paul. Final question here, Shauna, follow-up question to an earlier one. Thank you for your detailed explanation of the demand side. My follow-up question is this: why has demand dropped so low during this wet spring? Is this due to lower evaporation? What other factors are contributing?
Oh, yes, sir, sure. So the lower basin is largely a demand-driven basin. So what that means, we don't have to deal with, we're not a headwaters basin. We don't have to build space for runoff. We release from Lake Mead just what we need to meet our downstream demands. So if it's really wet in the lower basin, if there's a lot of rain, one more thing, most of the water use in the lower basin is agricultural use. So when it's really wet, when there's lots of rainstorms, those large ag districts, those large ag users, they just don't have the demand for water because it's all being met by the rain. Additionally, we had a couple municipal water users also impacted by the wet conditions this year. So that cut down the demands as well. We had one canal had some erosion damage. They had to stop pumping in order to do some repairs. Out in Arizona, the Salt River project system was filling up very, very quickly. They actually had some spill releases on the Verde side. So in terms of diverting water off the Colorado River system and storing it in those local reservoirs, there was no space. They had no capacity for storing water. So both the municipal side and the agricultural side, the water demands just were much, much lower.
Great. Thank you, Shauna. That's it for our questions. So I again want to thank you, Shauna and Paul, for sharing your expertise and your time with us today. It was really, really worthwhile. It was phenomenal presentations. Thank you. And thanks for taking the extra time for the Q&A. And for all the attendees, thank you for joining us. And we will put the recording of this webinar, including this question and answer session, onto the drought.gov website. Please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is at the top of your screen if you have any further questions or if you want to learn about webinars in the future. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye. Take care.